What if Rome's most humiliating secret became its most powerful ruler? In 67 AD, Emperor Nero, driven by grief, madness, or some unspeakable need for control, chose a boy named Sporus and erased him. He castrated him, dressed him in his dead wife's clothes, gave him her name, and married him in a grotesque public ceremony. History calls it a footnote, a tyrant's final descent into lunacy. Sporus is remembered only as a victim, an object passed between emperors until he took his own life. But what if that isn't the full story? What if Sporus, the silent, feminized boy paraded as Nero's bride, was never just a puppet? What if he was watching, learning, absorbing the rituals of power from inside the eye of the storm? This isn't just a tale of survival. It's the story of how a ghost in silk became an empress in blood. We're not just rewriting history, we're asking the question that haunts all empires. What happens when the mask they force you to wear becomes your real face? Sometime after Poppæa's death, Nero summoned a boy to the palace. His name was Sporus. Young, beautiful, and terrified. What happened next was one of the most disturbing attempts at resurrection in human history. Nero didn't just make Sporus wear Poppæa's dresses. He had the boy castrated, dressed in veils, taught to move, speak, and smile like his dead empress. The emperor staged a public wedding, complete with a dowry and torches, forcing Rome to witness his grief disguised as control. To most historians, this was depraved theatre, a tyrant crumbling, a child destroyed. But if you were Sporus, trapped in that golden cage, there was only one way to survive. Learn the role and play it perfectly. He studied Poppæa's rituals, her poise, her whispers, her command over silence. Every dinner with the imperial court was a masterclass in performance. Every touch from Nero, a test of composure. And Sporus passed, not just with obedience, but precision. The court called it submission. Nero called it love. But for Sporus, it was neither. It was adaptation. He was absorbing how Rome worked, how power dressed itself, how attention could be turned into leverage. He was turning the mask into a weapon. What looked like a boy in a dress was actually a spy in training. Behind the silks and cosmetics, Sporus trained in silence. He memorized court schedules, watched how rumors were seeded, and noted who bowed and who sneered. Sporus learned how Nero manipulated spectacle, how an emperor could dominate not through law or force, but with performance and fear. Over time, Sporus stopped merely surviving. He started predicting and influencing. At banquets, he whispered things Nero later repeated. In private, Sabina comforted advisors, then relayed their fears back to the emperor. His presence became familiar, then necessary. The court stopped calling him Sporus. They called him Sabina. In public, he was Nero's ghost wife. In private, he was becoming something far more dangerous. He was no longer pretending to be royalty. He was learning how to be royalty, and no one saw it coming. Nero's court was a fever dream of power. Murders staged like morality plays, decrees signed in drunken orgies, fear passed like wine. But behind it all, someone else had begun to take notes. Sporus, still called Sabina, was no longer just a figure of spectacle. He had become something more potent, a witness to the empire's decay. He wasn't merely in the room, he was in the conversations between rooms, in whispered apologies from frightened senators, in drunken confessions from commanders. And slowly he began to collect things, not gold, not titles, but information. If power in Rome came from being feared, Sporus was becoming dangerous in a new way, being underestimated. Nero began spiraling. His paranoia bloomed into brutality. Advisors vanished overnight. Trials turned into executions. The court lived in terror of the next outburst. But Sporus remained, not because he was safe, but because he had become essential. He calmed Nero during episodes, whispered when to soften a decree, arranged performances to keep Rome distracted. Nero believed Sporus was his comfort. The court believed Sporus was a pet. Both were wrong. Sporus was mapping every weakness in the room. Who owed money? Who craved power? Who hated whom? His silence became currency. His trauma became camouflage. And in the shadows, he wasn't alone. Among the enslaved and dismissed, the handmaids, scribes, freedmen, and guards, Sporus built a network of overlooked eyes and ears. These weren't formal alliances. They were favors, exchanges, shared grief. A servant who lost a sister to Nero's purges. A scribe who feared being next. A guard who couldn't sleep. Sporus became a mirror to their fears, and slowly a collector of their loyalty. But why? Why would someone so publicly humiliated, so physically marked, so politically invisible, begin to position himself as anything other than a survivor? Because Sporus had seen what came after love in the palace. Disposal. He knew Nero wouldn't last, and when that time came, he wouldn't beg for protection. He would offer it. Rome believed Sporus was Nero's shadow. But in truth, he was already preparing for life beyond Nero. Not as a freedman, not as a victim, but as a player. Before we continue, if you've made it this far, you already know this isn't just a story about Nero's madness. It's about the weapon he accidentally created. And in the next few minutes, you're going to see what happens when that weapon is unleashed. Not with armies, but with memory, myth, and something far more dangerous than revenge. Survival. In 68 AD, Nero died alone. Deserted by the court, declared an enemy of the state, and hiding in a crumbling villa, the last Julio-Claudian emperor ended his life with a blade to the throat. The empire he left behind unraveled instantly. 4 men, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, would claim the throne in one blood-soaked year. The Senate panicked, the people rioted, generals turned on each other like jackals. Rome wasn't being ruled, it was being auctioned off. And in the middle of this storm, one name vanished from all official records: Sporus. But disappearance isn't always disappearance. Sometimes it's strategy. Sporus didn't flee. He observed. The palace was no longer safe, so he moved quietly, through estates, through safe houses, through memory. He knew everyone in power, and more importantly, everyone just beneath them. The freedmen, the cooks, the scribes, the slaves who refilled wine cups and listened at doors. While emperors fell and armies marched, Sporus reactivated the network he'd built under Nero. Not with commands, with questions. Who is Galba afraid of? Who funds Vitellius's campaigns? Which Praetorians still fear Nero's ghost? He offered no loyalty, no threat, no promise of return. Only this: when the dust settles, Rome will need someone who remembers how the old world worked. And that was true. Sporus had lived through the fire of Nero's madness, and survived. He'd worn the mask of an empress. He'd memorized the language of power. Rome was crumbling, but Sporus, he had clarity. Let me ask you something. If you had been paraded, humiliated, nearly erased, and suddenly the empire that destroyed you lost its crown, would you disappear? Or would you wait, just long enough to claim the throne yourself? Galba was murdered. Otho committed suicide. Vitellius was dragged from hiding and executed in the streets. Sporus, invisible, survived them all. By the time Vespasian's forces secured Rome, Sporus was already planting seeds, whispering advice to generals through intermediaries, shielding allies within the Praetorian Guard, reframing his public image from Nero's victim to Nero's last heir to court wisdom. The empire didn't just need leadership, it needed myth. Sporus didn't arrive with legions. He arrived with symbolism. He had become the living memory of a dead dynasty, the only face from Nero's court that hadn't been purged. People remembered the silk, the veil, the public vows. And suddenly, those weren't signs of humiliation. They were survival. They were familiar. They were Roman. So when the chaos settled and Vespasian rose, Sporus stood at the center of something strange. Not quite a rebellion, not quite a party, a movement. The man who had once been forced to play Empress was now being asked to play it again. Only this time, on his terms. Rome had bled itself dry. Civil war, assassinations, starvation, the city's soul had hollowed out. And in the silence that followed, people weren't just hungry for food or safety. They were hungry for a story, a myth that could explain the chaos, a figure that could survive it, a name that could mean something again. And that name was Sporus. The victim Rome once pitied became the icon it now revered. He returned not with proclamations or armies, but with eyes that had seen emperors die and a voice that still knew how to whisper. Rumors began to spread that he had outlived 4 rulers by divine protection, that his suffering had made him wise, that he had worn death's face and emerged beautiful. In forums, street corners, temples, the name Sabina returned, not as a mockery, but as a symbol of survival. The people remembered the veil, the wedding, the boy in silks who had stood beside a mad god and lived. Now that boy had returned, older, colder, unbroken. And he didn't reject the costume they gave him. He wore it better than before.
What began as murmurs became ceremony. Sporus appeared at festivals, veiled, radiant, dignified. He was greeted by soldiers who had once mocked him and citizens who now bowed in reverence. He spoke little. He didn't need to. His presence was the message. Rome may collapse, but I endured. And in that endurance, people found meaning. It wasn't just the poor or the grieving who followed him. Veterans from Nero's court returned. Mid-ranking senators began to quote him in debates. Members of the Praetorian Guard, disillusioned by shifting loyalties, looked to him as a symbol of continuity. Slowly, Sporus built something Nero never could, devotion without terror. Of course, not everyone saw him as salvation. Some saw a dangerous myth forming, an unstable nostalgia for a dynasty that had collapsed in blood. But here's the truth. In Rome, myth always wins. The city had never been ruled purely by logic or law. It was ruled by omens, costumes, appearances, masks worn long enough to become faces. And Sporus, the boy they tried to erase, had become a living omen. Not of Nero's madness, but of Rome's survival. Rome had crowned madmen, murderers, generals, cowards. But never someone like Sporus, not someone they had once laughed at, not someone they had once pitied. And that made him the most dangerous kind of ruler, the one no one saw coming. By 70 AD, Vespasian was emperor. He had the armies, the treasury, the loyalty of the East. But in Rome itself, something was happening that even he couldn't control, a cult without temples, a coronation without decree, a ruler without title. The people weren't chanting for gods. They were chanting for her, for the empress who had died and returned. Sporus understood spectacle. He had lived inside it. So he gave Rome what it craved and what it feared. He held audiences draped in gold-threaded robes, flanked by guards who once belonged to Nero's detail. He accepted petitions from widows, war orphans, and veterans. He appeared at shrines with a laurel crown over his veil. He was never crowned. But he didn't have to be. The city began referring to him as Domina, the feminine form of Dominus, the title reserved for the most powerful women in the empire. Then came the moment that rewrote everything. At dawn, Sporus stood atop the Capitoline steps. Behind him, the temple to Jupiter loomed. Below, the forum buzzed with whispers. The Praetorian Guard marched forward, not to arrest, not to protect, but to kneel. A hush fell over the square, and in one smooth motion, Sporus raised his hand. The same hand Nero once held at a wedding altar. This time, the empire bowed to him. Historians later called it a crisis. Some called it a coup. But the truth is simpler. Sporus had become more than a person. He had become a solution. The chaos of civil war had exhausted the people. They didn't care who ruled, as long as someone did. And Sporus offered them what no other contender could: familiarity. Survival, continuity wrapped in theater. The Senate, shocked and powerless, issued no challenge. Merchants bent the knee. Foreign envoys sent gifts. Rome, it seemed, had an empress, and yet, in that triumph, the tragedy begins. Because Sporus, once erased by Nero, was now wearing Nero's crown, surrounded by the same flatterers, protected by the same violence. He had taken control of the machine that had once destroyed him. The question was no longer how he would rule, but whether he could rule without becoming what he had once survived. In the golden halls of power, Sporus ruled, not through conquest, not through bloodshed, but through presence, the quiet, calculated weight of silence, spectacle, and survival. For a time, it worked. Grain flowed, the streets calmed, the Senate obeyed. Rome, exhausted by chaos, gave him space to rule. Sporus had won. He had transformed public shame into legitimacy. He had weaponized memory, but power always asks for more. To maintain loyalty, he exiled those who mocked him. To silence rivals, he revived Nero's informants. And one day, quietly, he ordered an execution. Just one, justified, necessary. But that's how it starts, isn't it? He no longer wore Nero's veil. He commissioned new ones, crimson-lined, stiff with imperial embroidery. he moved with imperial grace. He spoke in ritual phrases. He rarely showed his eyes in public. The transformation was complete. But at night, when the court emptied and the candles burned low, he would sit alone in front of a mirror. It had once belonged to Poppaea, the original empress. Cracked in one corner, polished obsidian, he stared into it. Not as Sabina, not as Nero's bride, not even as Sporus, just a face. He had taken everything he'd been forced to become, and worn it until it no longer felt forced at all. That was the final irony. To defeat the empire, he had to become it. The boy who once flinched at power was now the one others feared. The people still whispered his name. Statues rose. Festivals were declared. But the boy inside the one Nero renamed and reshaped had vanished. History forgets the rest. Some say Sporus ruled for only months. Others say he disappeared, again consumed by palace intrigue or his own despair. But that isn't the real ending. The real ending is here, in the mirror. In the silence, when the mask doesn't just stay on, it becomes the face. Sporus entered history as a joke, a bizarre footnote, a victim dressed in silk, paraded by a mad emperor. But if even half of what we've explored here is true, then Sporus wasn't a footnote. He was a fulcrum, a survivor who learned to wear his pain like armor, a mirror held up to a collapsing empire, a boy forced to become someone else, who decided to stay that way. And maybe that's what makes this story so haunting. Not the cruelty, not even the revenge, but the question it leaves us with: if someone takes everything from you, your body, your name, your past, and you build something powerful from the wreckage, do you ever really get to be yourself again, or does the mask always win? Rome would fall, again and again. Emperors would rise. Tyrants would die. But in the quiet corners of empire, behind every ritual, every symbol, every mask, you can still see Sporus, watching, reminding us that the most terrifying rulers aren't born. They're made. If stories like this make you rethink history and the people we erase, subscribe for more. And tell us in the comments, was Sporus a victim, a ruler, or something Rome never had a name for?